instead of doing Mark, I was thinking, because it's Martin Luther King's Day tomorrow, right? Yeah. So we'll do something somehow to honor that day in some sense, because it might be awkward to do it in any other time. Okay, so and I know it's not very common among churches to actually talk about, even celebrate Martin Luther King's Day, but it's a holiday, right? So we're celebrating it. Many of us are off tomorrow. Okay, and I think it's actually worth celebrating. It's actually worth honoring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about church as prophetic people. Okay, church as what? Prophetic people. Okay. Probably one of the things that you'll probably realize after the sermon today is that prophetic doesn't really mean the way we tend to use that term. Okay, it's not. It doesn't really have doesn't have a lot to do with the foretelling. A prophetic ministry is very similar to what we see in Martin Luther King, right? So that's why I decided to actually do something like this. So church as what? As prophetic people. Okay, so in honor of MLK. Okay, so MLK, that doesn't mean milk. Okay, it's just it's just Martin Luther King. Okay, so let's start. Let me just briefly say something about him quickly. He's an American Baptist pastor. Okay, you guys know that. Okay, he was the most visible spokesperson and leader of the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1968. It's a very long time. He fought racial inequality through nonviolent resistance. So I think he's well known for that. He received the Nobel Prize for that. Okay, he's a flawed man. Okay, so is that clear? We know that he was known to have extramarital affairs or something like that. So he was a flawed man who was mightily used by what? Mightily used by God. Okay, MLK Day became a federal holiday in 1986. It was signed by President Reagan. Republican president. Okay, so and that's the reason why we celebrate it. It's a federal holiday. It's a holiday for the post office too. Okay, right. So no bill. Right. So why as a church do we need to celebrate his legacy? Okay, why do we need to celebrate his legacy? I'm going to look at the Bible later on. I just wanted to prepare ourselves for this message today. Now, the whole world, in particular the U.S., was changed because of what he and others who were with him did. Whether you like it or not, we are all beneficiaries of what? Of what he did. You have to understand, he's a controversial figure. Many people didn't really like him during his time. But whether you like it or not, whatever he accomplished, in some sense, created the kind of world that we have now. And it didn't just happen in the U.S., it actually spilled all over, and it actually influenced what? The whole entire world. Our understanding of human rights is somehow also what? Changed, right? By because of what he did, or not just he, but there are other people with him. Like what I said a while ago, he was just the most what? The most visible. Do you guys follow me? He was just the most visible. Now, people's way of thinking on race relations was dramatically changed due to what he and others what? He and others did. Now, you guys know that his activism is actually Christian-inspired. You guys know that. In one of his, I think it was an interview on his letter, I have a quote here. I don't know if you guys can read it from where you're at. And I'll just read this quickly. He said, "Before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first calling, and it still remains my greatest what? Commitment. Actually, all that I do in civil rights, I do because I consider it a part of my ministry." That's what he said. "I have no other ambitions in life but to achieve excellence in the Christian ministry. I don't plan to run for any political office. I don't plan to do anything but remain a preacher. And what I'm doing in this struggle, along with many others, grows out of my feeling that the preacher must be concerned about the whole man." Meaning the whole, not just the spiritual life, right? But not just the emotional life, but the whole entire what? The whole entire being. Do you guys follow me? So he mentioned it himself, that this is an extension of his what? Of his ministry, whatever he did, okay? Now, like what I said, we're not here to worship him or anything like that. We know he's a flawed what? He's a flawed man, right? He was a controversial figure. And here the point is not about the controversies behind the man, right? But it's more about what what did he accomplish? It looked like he had a legacy. He actually changed the way we think. He changed the way we live, and he attributed that passion to make that change happen from his Christian commitment. At least that's what he attributed it to. Okay, and then lastly, I want to say this: his legacy provides us an example of how the message of Jesus can significantly change the world through prophetic activism. Just by doing prophetic ministry, he actually what? He changed the world. Do you guys follow me here, right? That's part of his legacy. That's part of, he thought that he was doing something, that this is an extension of what? The message of Jesus. Okay? Now, so let me begin with this, because I know some people might not find the relevance of actually even looking at this kind of issues like in a church like this. Personal problems. Obviously, the church has to be concerned about our personal problems. I agree to that, right? That's what we do most of the time. We all have petty problems. I have petty problems myself, right? Florence knows that. Okay, she's the only one who knows. Okay, about my petty problems. Okay, we all have emotional problems. We all have cognitive problems. The way it has something to do with how we think. We have behavioral problems. Do you guys find? We all have those things. These are personal problems we have. We have relationship problems. We have physical problems. We have financial problems. We have spiritual problems. All of those have something to do with what? With us as individuals. However, if we get accustomed into thinking that the church should only be concerned about our personal problems, then our understanding of how the church should function becomes what? Really cheap. You guys following me here, right? It becomes self-centered. Does that make sense? It becomes socially insignificant. It becomes, a mere form of what? Feel-goodism. It becomes superficial. It becomes, it's all about me kind of thing. Do you guys follow me? So once in a while, there's a need for churches, or for, especially even in our church here, right, to actually take our attention away from ourselves, right, and then look at the bigger picture and look at the extent of the ministry of the church. That it actually has a wider scope. I hope you guys are following me here. It has a wider scope. We're not just thinking about what? We're not just looking inwardly, right, but we're also looking at what? Outwardly. And usually, people who actually are concerned about, concerns that is outside of their own selves, they're the ones who tend to what? Change the world. Whether we like it or not. They are the ones who what? Change the world. Now, imagine if these people actually were just simply concerned about themselves. Right? Let's suppose, Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, Martin Luther King, right? Those people whom we consider to be somehow like heroes, right? In some sense. Imagine if they just stayed home and not do what? Not do anything and just worry about their own personal needs. I'm assuming things will not be transformed in the way things were transformed in history. Do you guys, does that make sense? Now, so let's look at this. So what is the social dimension of the Christian life and the church? So what I wanted to do here, I wanted to establish our sense of what? Social responsibility as Christians. We do have what? Social responsibilities. We don't just have responsibilities to take care of ourselves. We have responsibilities for others as well. Okay. And so this is not, I'm not claiming this because I'm not saying that I'm involved in that kind of stuff, right? But this is what we wanted to envision about our church. Is a church that will be complete in some sense. We're taking care of our personal needs by, you come here and then our needs are met, our personal needs. But we're also encouraged to what? To go beyond, our concern for our own selves. Okay. Now, so what are the biblical foundations for this? Okay. So let me just look at a few Bible verses here, and then after that we'll go and talk about other things. Okay. So the mere presence of the church in the world must have social ramifications. Christians have responsibilities for their societies. The mere presence that we have here, right? That means, we have a social function as a group of what? Of followers of Jesus. I want you to actually look at Matthew 5:13 to 16. And this is, and here's what it says. You are the salt of the earth. So the mere presence that you have, right? It's of some value to what? To this planet, supposedly, right? You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be what? Be restored. It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. Okay. So first you said you were like the salt of what? Of the earth. Now you are what? The light of the world. So just see what I'm trying to point out here? Your mere presence here on earth, right? It has to have some kind of what? Value, right? In relation to the world, right? A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Now, our mere presence in the world must make a difference in that world. Okay. The mere presence of salt in a thing makes it salty. Since its saltiness is its only what? Function. Do you guys follow what I'm talking about here? So that's why we call it saltiness, right? It looks like, the root of the word saltiness, right, is in the salt, right? It has something to do with its taste. So tasteless salt is utterly what? Useless. Tasteless salt is utterly what? Useless, right? In the same way, the mere presence of light in a place make things visible. So an invisible light is utterly what? Useless. Now, so what does that imply? A Christian who does not live and think in the way he or she is supposed to live and think is pretty much what? Useless. That's the point, right? The point of the saltiness of the salt is because what? Because of its saltiness. So you lose that, then you lose its function. The same thing for the church. If we fail to become salts of the earth, if we fail to become lights of the world, then we're what? We're pretty much useless. That's pretty much the point here. You guys are following me here? Right? Now, so what about this? Matthew 25:31 to 46. Now, I'm not gonna read the whole entire text. Okay, I just wanted to actually read here. I gave you some few excerpts here, right? Now, here Jesus was talking about the inheritors of the kingdom. Okay, and he described the inheritors of the kingdom in the following way. He said, when I was hungry, right, you gave me what? Food. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to what? Something to drink. When I was a stranger, right, you welcomed me. When I was naked, right, and you gave me what? Clothing. When I was sick, you take care of me, or you took care of me, right? When I was in prison, you what? And you visited me. Remember, the people ask, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty? When did we see you a stranger, right? When did we see you naked? When did we see you being sick? When did we see you in prison? And Jesus said something like this. He said, just as you did it to one of the least of this, who are members of my family, you did it to me. Now, do you guys see the social dimension here of our existence as Christians? Again, Jesus was even talking about this is how you inherit the kingdom. Usually when we think about inheriting the kingdom, we just tell people, oh, just pray the sinner's prayer, then you will just go straight to what? For sure you'll go to heaven. Yeah. But Jesus was actually giving what? A very, it's a profound requirement here. It looks like it's not just about what praying the sinner's prayer. It actually means more. What? More than just praying the sinner's prayer. Yes. The neglect that we find in churches today, and this includes Symposia too, right? The neglect of the social dimension, right, of our existence as Christians might be detrimental, right, to establishing our own identity as followers of what? Followers of Christ. I hope you guys are following me here. Does that make sense? Okay. There's something detrimental about it because, we're pretty much, if this is part of our identity and we're not even what? Doing it, then something must be wrong. Okay. Now, followers of Jesus have social responsibilities. Let's just face it. Followers of Jesus have what? Social responsibilities. Their social responsibilities are integral parts of their spiritual lives. It's not just something that you have to do as an extra thing, right? But this is an integral part of what it means to be what? To be a Christian. We have an obligation towards the poor. We have an obligation towards the oppressed. We have an obligation towards the marginalized. We have an obligation towards the unfairly treated. We have a responsible obligation to the exploited ones. We have an obligation to what? The nobodies in the society. Those are part of our obligations as Christians. And I hope I'm making sense here. I know this is not an exciting kind of sermon because it has nothing to do with our own personal lives. But once in a while, I think we need to get out of that that zone, right? Where, we just think that Christianity is just about us. But we lose the social dimension of it, then we pretty much defeat the purpose of becoming a follower of Jesus. If Jesus says, this is what you need to do in order to inherit the kingdom of God, and we're barely even doing it. Now, again, when I say we, I'm literally referring to myself, right? Because I think what we're trying to do, we are in the process of self-discovery, right? What the church should be like. What should we be doing, right? And I know there's something unattractive about thinking about the social dimensions of our existence. Because it really has nothing to do with what? It's us. As a matter of fact, it requires that we sacrifice something of ourselves so that we can actually what? Meet the needs of other people. Okay. And that's why there's nothing naturally interesting about that. Because we're naturally driven to actually what? Look at ourselves. Not just you. I'm referring to what? Myself here. Okay. Now, so what happened here? I think there's a missing. Sorry. There's a missing slide. Let me see if I can find it. I apologize for this. Is there a reason why it's not showing? Sorry. Technical difficulties. Okay. Oh, there you go. It's there. Oh, it's not here. Okay. It's not showing here, so I'll just look at that. Thanks, Gene. So there are also biblical foundations for the promotion of justice. Okay. The Bible called God what? The God of justice. Now, we always talk about God of love. And every time we use the word God of justice, we're always thinking of God punishing, the evil people. But that's not actually what it meant. When it says God of justice, that God really wants justice. That people will be treated what? Fairly. Do you guys follow? It has nothing to do with, we always invoke, right, the justice of God when we are upset about sinners. But that's not really what it's about. It has something to do with, people being treated what? Fairly. Now, God as a lover of justice. And I gave you the verses there, right? You can just read that for yourself, right? Or as one who administers through justice. So one thing we know is that God is a God of what? Justice. Okay. That thing is clear in the Bible. Secondly, acting justly as a good that God requires us to do. Right? Can somebody read Micah 6:8? For those of you who have your Bibles with you. Micah 6:8. Because I think this is actually a good passage to read. Okay. I just want you to see. Anybody who wants to read it for us? Micah 6:8. Go ahead.
It says Micah 6:8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God.
Okay. Yeah. So is that this is God told you what is actually good. What is good? To act justly. Right. And then some other things like about righteousness and stuff like that. Right. Now, so and then in Leviticus 19:15 it says, "Judge the poor and your neighbor's what? justly, right? Now, the promotion of justice is undeniably a part of the biblical tradition. It's part of the responsibilities of what? God's people. I hope that's clear. We hardly hear messages about this, but whether you like it or not, that is part of what it means to be a part of this biblical faith. I hope I'm making sense here. Does that make sense? So now, what about, so here's the problem then, right? The persistence of what? Social evils. The persistence of what? Social evils. The same social evils that they encountered the prophets, right? Jesus and those people in the biblical times. You know that same social evils are actually what? Remain to be in existence today. And that's the reason why there's a need for us to actually respond, right? Understanding the nature, the scope of our social responsibility. Now, what is a social evil anyways? Okay, so this is just my own definition. I might be wrong about this, but this is how at least I understood the terms. Okay, I think I'll have a lot of time to really figure out what this is about. But at least when I use the term, or the phrase, social evil, this is what I have in mind. A social evil has to do with the inevitable outcome of a trend, a habit, an ideology, a belief, a cultural assumption or practice, a way of thinking or living, or a social reality that is profoundly destructive of what? Of a society. I don't know what to call it. I'm assuming it has something to do with some kind of a trend, a habit, a practice that a society has that is actually destructive of its own what? Of its own self. Does that make sense? So let me give you examples of this. Okay, racism persists, whether we like it or not. It's like I told you before. You'll find racist. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what type of people you are. Yeah. Do you guys follow me here? There are many Filipino racists. I know. I heard them. Okay. So when I say racism here, this is not just a problem with white people or something like that. It's a problem with everybody. Do you guys following me here, right? So racism persists even until today. Of course, it's not as bad as before. I'm not claiming that it's actually what? It's the same as before. But it persists even until what? Even until today. As long as there are racist political rhetoric and cultural changes that are deemed as disadvantageous to the larger group of people, it will be a problem that is here to what? To stay. It will be here to stay. I'm not saying that we will be able to eradicate this, but the point I wanted to make is that at some point Christians need to realize that we have a responsibility to figure out a way how to actually what? To figure out a way to eliminate it as much as we can possibly do it, right? But is that clear so far? I don't want to exaggerate the fact that when we talk about this, I'm not saying that it's getting worse, right? It was worse back then, right? But still, it's reoccurring in some sense. You see this in the news over and over again, right? It's reoccurring. But I don't think it's really reoccurring. It's always been like this for a long time. It's just now we have Facebook, so there are people who can actually what? Share it and post it. Yeah, so we see a lot of cases of this, but I think those kind of cases have been happening all this time. Okay, we just didn't know. So the church, generally has been known to be indifferent, complicit, silent, or even participants in acts or culture that can be deemed as racist. That's just bad part of our history as a church. Right? Either we are what? Indifferent, complicit, right? Silent, and sometimes we even participate, right? In acts or cultures, right? That are actually what? That can be deemed as racist. Just look at slavery. Did you guys know that many of the Christians during the period when slavery was somehow legal, they approve of those things. They even defended it using the Bible. They were defending it using the Bible. That's what they were doing. The Holocaust, the same thing, right? Christians were what? Silent. Either they're silent, complicit, indifferent, or they're participants in it. Remember when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was actually criticizing the church? Because according to him, the reason why all of these social evils are taking place is because the church was actually quiet the whole time. They were not saying anything. Do you guys following me here, right? Now again, we're talking about 6 million Jews dying here, right? And the church was somehow what? Somehow silent. That's bad when you think about it, right? Look at the Jim Crow era. Remember, this is what Martin Luther King Jr. was actually pointing out too. He said, how come the church are silent? Churches are silent about these matters. You know, there are people who are already being mistreated, but the church is somehow what? Silent the whole time. Isn't that weird? The church was not even like leading the group of actually, you know, trying to criticize the practice, the habit, right? The culture. Okay? Now, so, as a matter of fact, I found this article last night from Christianity Today. The title was, "Why Did So Many Christians Support Slavery?" And a Baptist minister said something like this. Baptist minister during the time of slavery. Okay? He said, slavery stands as an institution of God. He defended that God is the one who actually what? Established it. Do you guys follow me here? Right? You know, prophetic activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Bonhoeffer, who were both Christian ministers, pointed this out as a problem with the church. But as a matter of fact, even when you look at the history, racism became what? A major part of the history of even evangelicalism. Remember the Southern Baptist, I think it was the Southern Baptist church that just recently, you know, denounced or condemned racism, which is weird. All this time it's been what? Condemned directly by people. How come they're just going to do this right now, just officially condemning it as something wrong? Right? Again, I think in some sense the church also what? Failed. Now, is that clear? Now, so inequalities persist, okay? There are profound inequalities between the rich and the poor. We all know that. Even in the U.S., not just in the Philippines, but even here, right? When a big chunk of the wealth is actually owned by just probably what? 1% or 2% or 3% of the people. And then the 50% are probably shared by like hundreds of millions of people. I hope you guys are following me here, right? Now, there are profound inequalities between men and women. Whether you like it or not, there are profound inequalities. You look at salaries of men and women, men tend to make significantly what? More than women, even if they actually have exactly the same position in some sense. So some people wonder whether there's something systemic going on here. How come that's actually the case? There are profound inequalities between members of majority group and members of different minority groups. Again, these are inequalities. Okay? Now, xenophobia persists also. So here's another problem, right? Xenophobia is unwarranted fear and distrust of people who came from another country that has a culture that is foreign or strange to us. Right? I said unwarranted fear, right? Or unwarranted what? Distrust. So, for example, it appears that Muslims from the Middle East, and refugees or immigrants from South America are the usual victims of what? Xenophobia. Probably not so much about Filipinos because we're pretty quiet, right? So no one really talks about Filipinos in the news, right? But usually Muslims from Middle Eastern countries. You know, Asian Muslims, they don't usually get affected by this. You guys know that there are more Muslims in Asia than in the Middle East, right? You guys know that in Indonesia, right? Right. But of course, the Indonesian Muslims are not getting the bad rap here, right? But it's all what the people who come from the Middle East, right? Now, I'm not talking about border security here. Border security is what? It's a political issue. We're not dealing with that. That's not the issue that I'm addressing here. I'm concerned with how we should treat people morally and humanely as what? Christians. As Christians. Does that make sense? How should we treat them humanely? Now, do you guys follow me here? Yeah. Right? That's the concern. The concern, I'm not talking about, everybody wants to secure the border. So that's not the issue. The issue has more to do with how should we treat them, right? Those refugees, those illegal aliens, right? How should we treat them? Do you guys following me here? How should we treat them? Another thing, homophobia, okay, persists. Okay, I am referring to phobias against members of what? The LGBTQ community. Now, it is a reasonable conviction for a Christian to be opposed to same-sex marriage. So I have nothing against that, right? So if you're opposed to same-sex marriage, that's that's a reasonable what? Conviction. But that should not give you a license to mistreat them or to treat them inhumanely or immorally. Do you guys following me here, right? Everyone is welcome to worship God in Symposia, whether or not we decide to collectively accept their lifestyle. We haven't really decided on how should we deal with that kind of issue. But one thing is for sure, we are not going to kick them out. We're going to welcome them. However, but that does not mean that we will be pressured to give up some of our convictions. If you have those convictions, that's up to you. Those are reasonable convictions. I'm not saying that those are bad convictions. They're reasonable, right? But one thing God doesn't want us to do is to reject people just because they're part of that community. I hope that's clear. Right? They're free to worship God here, right? They will be treated humanely. They will be treated, just like anybody else. Okay, I hope you guys are following me here. Okay, and again, I don't want you to see that as if I'm disrespecting some of your convictions, because I do understand those kind of convictions. I think those are reasonable. The only problem is that that we're called to love people, and we'll let God do the judging. Okay, if you think God will judge them, let God do that. Okay, is that clear? Right. So homophobia actually what persists. Okay. Erosion of respect for the life of the unborn. Erosion of what? Respect for the life of the unborn. Now, I think that abortion is legally justifiable. Legally. However, in most cases, it is obviously what? Immoral. But the main fact that it's immoral doesn't mean that we have to what? Make it illegal. Do you guys following here, right? We think adultery is immoral, but we don't think adultery should be what? Should be illegal. Do you guys following me here, right? Now, so the point I'm trying to make is, I think it's legally justifiable because I think there are good reasons for thinking that it should be legalized. However, in most cases, it is obviously what? Immoral. There are cases when it's not obviously immoral. Okay? Let's just face that. When the life of the mother is in danger, you guys find it looks like abortion might be permissible in those cases. When a 13-year-old girl was actually raped and, do you guys following me? Get pregnant, then probably abortion might be, right, somehow justifiable in those kind of cases. When the baby in the womb of the mother, right, actually does not have a brain. And surely when it gets out of the womb, right, it probably will only survive for a few hours. We already know that. So if that's something that can already be detected, then it might be justifiable, morally speaking, right, to actually what? Abort those fetuses. But majority of cases of fetuses that are aborted are not like that. Yes. And that's the reason why the church must what? Must speak up. So there's nothing wrong about, do you guys following me here? Right? Christians should support policies that reasonably restrict the scope of legalized abortion. I didn't say to make it illegal, but to just what? Restrict it. Okay? That's their way of defending what? The unborn. Do you guys following him, right? Because there are people who will argue that, that even when the baby is about to come out of the womb, you can actually what? You can actually abort it or something like that. There are people who will argue for that position. I think that's bad already. Do you guys following here, right? Probably first few weeks, it might still be justifiable. Someone who doesn't want it, and they found out, that they're like what, 2 weeks, 3 weeks pregnant. That's probably still justifiable. But we need to figure out how to restrict that, right? So we cannot let respect for the life of the unborn to somehow what? Erode. I hope you guys are following me. Does that make sense? It is not a political claim. I'm just talking about as Christians. These are things that we should be worried about, but at the same time, we should be reasonable. We should be sensible. I hope I'm making sense here. Okay. Now, other concerns: exploitations of workers in big companies. We know this, right? Big companies will actually pay their workers like very low salary, and they will expect them to get what? Food stamps and stuff like that, right? The government to actually provide whatever is what the other needs. But again, that's just a form of greed. Okay? Consumerism and greed, which clearly destroy what? Human lives. Again, the church is also what? Inflicted by this. Consumerism and what? And greed, right? So we need to speak up against those things, right? It destroys family, it destroys people's lives. The lack of common values among people in a pluralistic and globalist society. We live in a society where we're so what? We're all completely different from each other. So we all have what? Competing, opposing values. The lack of what? Unifying values is somehow, somehow it might destroy our society. So we need to speak up for those kind of things, right? Corruptions in government and churches. Neglect of people with severe physical or cognitive disabilities. Do you guys know that even in churches, the disabled people are actually what? Ignored and probably not even paid attention to. Does that make sense? Right? So somehow, as a church, we need to figure out a way how to speak for them. Churches' complacency or participation in the midst of social evils, abuses of political powers, violations of human rights. Other concerns, right? Those are the other concerns. Okay. Now, so the prophetic response, the prophetic as a response to social evil. What time is it now? We're almost done. Actually, I only have a few more slides left. You guys are following what I'm doing here so far? I know it's too heavy, right? This kind of discussion, right? But the point is, this is a way of opening up our minds, okay? Because these are the things that we have to deal with as a church, okay? The prophetic as a response to what? Social evils, right? And I know this kind of sermon will not get a lot of likes, okay? Right? Or will not get a lot of hearts. But we're not here to talk about things that are popular, okay? Does that make sense? If you want it to be a church, you want it to be a bearer of what is true, not what is popular. It's so easy to make things sound popular, right? Because I can just preach about things that make everybody will feel good. That's easy to do. As a matter of fact, you don't even need to prepare for those things. Does that make sense? Right? Now, so the prophetic as a response to what? Social evils. Prophecy. Okay? In the Bible, prophecy does not usually mean foretelling future events. It's just Christians today got used to actually thinking of it and thinking of prophecy in that way. When you think of prophecy, what do you think about? It's about telling something that will happen what? In the future. But that's not how the Bible commonly used that particular term. According to Roger Olson, a professor of theology at Baylor University, it actually, for the most part, means forthtelling, meaning speaking God's truth to God's people, other people, and rulers, speaking those truths with power that can convict people about their sins. That's prophecy. When you speak God's truth, right, to God's people, and that convicted them of their sins, that is what? Prophecy. That's a prophecy. I hope you guys are following me here. Right? That's what we call prophecy. According to him, a true prophecy challenges the status quo and calls for God's will to be done in specific circumstances. A prophet is one who challenges what? Injustices, unrighteousness, mercilessness, greed, and other causes of what? Social evils. That was always the function of what? Of prophets. I really don't know why Christians ended up thinking that prophecy really has a lot to do with foretelling future events. I think it's this hype about the rapture, right? Made people think, you guys, we've been in church for a long time. You guys heard about the rapture, right? I think the hype about the rapture somehow makes us think that prophecy has something to do with just foretelling future events. But that's actually not what it is about, at least for the most part in the scriptures. Is that clear so far? It's about speaking God's truth. Now, so who do I have in mind when I say prophets by foretelling? So when you look at the Old Testament prophets, that's actually what they did. They were actually challenging what? The kings. They were challenging what? The rulers of other nations. They were challenging. It's not about foretelling, right? But it's about foretelling. They're speaking the truth of God, right? To convict people of their what? Of their sins, right? So if you read Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, and others, they were doing exactly the same thing. They were criticizing the priests. They were criticizing, they were doing something like that. John the Baptist was also a prophet in this sense. He was not foretelling future events. What was he doing? He was challenging authorities. Jesus did the same thing. He was challenging what? The authorities, right? And here's another one that probably big news for many people. The author of Revelation was actually doing something similar. I remember teaching a class on Revelation at Charisma before, right, a long time ago. And I read Revelation as actually not foretelling future events. But the author of Revelation was actually what? Challenging the Roman Empire. But he was using symbolic language to actually what? To actually challenge the Roman Empire. What he's saying is that eventually God will be the one who will actually what? Rule. You might persecute us. Are you guys following me? You might do this, such and such things to us. But eventually God is the one who will actually what? Prevail. And the Roman Empire will somehow be what? Will be destroyed. I hope you guys are following me here. Okay? Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, the German Protestant reformer, did exactly what? Same thing too. He was challenging what? Authorities. Martin Luther King Jr. was actually what? Doing the same thing. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, he was actually with Martin Luther King Jr. They were in the civil rights movement. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the one who actually what? Was challenging Hitler. He was the pastor who was executed, right? He was hanged because he was actually accused of plotting the killing of Hitler. He was a pastor. He was already here in the U.S. He went back to Germany in order to figure out a way how to actually what? Fight Hitler in a non-violent way, supposedly. But I think he became a part of this plot to actually assassinate Hitler. Karl Barth was the same thing, a theologian who actually opposed what? Hitler also. Cornel West is a contemporary guy. He also seems to be a prophet. Oscar Romero, Gustavo Gutierrez, these are Catholic priests who actually what? Who challenged the government, right? Because of the abusiveness of the government towards the poor. Do you guys follow what I'm pointing out here? There are other people. These are people that we can use as examples. Okay, that's why I list their names here. Now, our prophetic calling. I think prophethood, not just priesthood of every believer. You guys heard the claim that the priesthood of all believers, that, you know, it means that every individual has direct access now with God, that we can actually what? Commune with God directly, rather than the priest will actually what? Commune with God for us. Because this is the major Protestant teaching, right? That we can now pray to what? Pray to God. You guys notice our Catholic brothers and sisters, how they're different from us? They will have to use like some kind of an imagery or a saint as some kind of a way to connect them to what? To God in some sense. And so some of them might find it weird that Protestants just close their eyes and directly commune with God, right? So that's what we call the priesthood of all what? Of all believers. But I wanted to argue that it's not just priesthood of all believers, but the prophethood of all what? Believers. Each of us must aim to speak God's truth to God's people, to people in general, and to rulers. Right? Now, this is not a political calling. I'm not talking about politics here. This is what? A moral calling to be socially responsible for the lives and just treatments of other people. It is what? A moral calling to be socially responsible for the lives and just treatments of what? Of other people. Even if you do not feel like it is your calling, and I'm not claiming that it is the calling of everyone, you should at least support the exercises of such prophetic what? Calling. Whether you like it or not, it is an inevitable part of the calling of the church. That's just part of what it means to be a church. That we need to speak for those who are oppressed, marginalized. Do you guys following me here? Unjustly mistreated, unjustly treated. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, last part. Or why should we, or what should each of us do? How do we do this? One is this. Cultivate spiritual sensitivities through prayer. Now, what does prayer do? What does it do? Prayer. It opens our minds to God's special what? Revelation of relevant truths. You know, Bible reading also becomes a big part of this, in order to establish continuity with the biblical faith. That's the only way you can understand that what we do now is in continuity with what? what God's people were doing in the past. We read the Bible, right? So we see that what we're doing is somehow what? Has continuity. Okay? Secondly is this. Cultivate intellectual sensitivities to what's happening around you. Cultivate what? Intellectual sensitivities. How do you do this? Be informed by reliable sources of information. Do you guys follow what I'm pointing out here? Right? You know, again, you cannot do a prophetic ministry and be dumb at the same time. You're just going to confuse people. You're just going to mislead people. Do you guys find? That's why you have to be what? You have to be informed. Just read newspapers, right? You know, that's something fun to do for us, right? I'm assuming, right? Just read newspapers. Just read reliable sources of information. Read magazines. Just be informed. That's just part of what it means to do the prophetic ministry. Cultivate wisdom to determine divine insights. Cultivate what? Wisdom. You might be knowledgeable, but if you're unwise, you're not going to get insights from God. Right? You guys know there are people who are informed, but they're not wise. Okay? There are people who are probably wise, but not informed. Okay? That's why you have to be knowledgeable and at the same time, be wise. Right? Because that's the only way you can actually get insights from God. I hope I'm making sense here. Another one is cultivate virtuous sensitivities. Now, what do I mean by this? You need to have courage if you're going to do the prophetic ministry of the church. If you're going to somehow, embody that in some sense. You have to what? You have to have courage to speak modestly, sensibly, humbly, with conviction, and with power. Right? You have to have courage. You guys know those prophets in the Old Testament? They were courageous. Because every time they say something, most of the time no one really believes them. And that's the hard part, right? When you're saying something and no one is believing you. Okay? Isn't that the case with prophets? Right? They'll say something and then everybody mocks them for what they're saying. I hope you guys are following me here, right? So you have to have courage. Another one is cultivate rhetorical sensitivities to effectively proclaim God's truth. Now, what do I mean by this? If you look at the prophets, even when you look at Martin Luther King Jr., they're very poetic the way they say things. They say things in a way that is actually what? Compelling. I hope you guys are following me here. Okay? Now, if you don't think that this is for you, then at least you can support such ministry of the church through prayers and what? And promotions. Okay. Is that clear? Now, lastly, does the prophetic work? The prophetic ministry, does that work? It's hard to say whether it works or not, right? It's like you're asking the question, does philosophy make a difference, right? Because I teach philosophy. So people always ask that question. Does philosophy make a difference? Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher in the early part 20th century, when he was asked that question, this is his reply. He said, look at the lives of those people who studied philosophy. Okay. So I'm going to actually use the same response. Does the prophetic work? Here's what I'm going to say. Just look at those who were engaged in prophetic activism in the past. Our lives and societies are better now due to the works of those people. You guys following here? Without Martin Luther King Jr., without, Cesar Chavez, without Abraham Lincoln. Are you guys following me here? Without Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that German activist, right, against Hitler. Without those people, the world we have now, that we inhabit, will be completely different. Actually, they made a big contribution. Just imagine, most of us here are Filipinos. We will not be able to live the kind of life that we have now if somehow the vision of Martin Luther King Jr. was not even realized. Do you guys following me here? We benefited from the works of these people in some sense. Okay? Whether we like it or not. Christianity made certain social goods what? Possible. Okay? Again, these were people who were inspired by Christianity, by their faith. Okay? And then lastly, the prophetic allows us to see the unfolding of the right side of history. And this is what the prophetic, in some sense, tells us. Which side of history is the right one. But from God's standpoint, whatever is just, whatever is the one that promotes justice, whatever is the one that promotes righteousness, that is the right side of history. I hope you guys are following me here. It can never be on the side of those people who like to oppress. It cannot be on the side of those people who exploit other people. It's always on the side of what? Justice. It's always on the side of righteousness. And I think Christians have a big role, right, in this pursuit. I hope you guys learned something from here, right? You know, I'm not asking you to become activists, right? Go out there and rally, protest. I don't do that myself, right? Do you guys follow me? Like, but that's not the point I'm trying to make here. But it's more like changing our way of thinking about what it means to be a church. Does that make sense? If church is simply just about singing and going to church and just feel good about ourselves, then we're fooling ourselves. We're fooling ourselves because that's not what the church is supposed to be anyway in the first place. We're supposed to be a group of people who are convicted by the truth of God, right? Convicted by what? The truth of God to actually pursue our social responsibilities. Amen? Amen. Okay. So let's pray. Any question here? And again, I have no intention to bore you to death, right? I already knew when I was actually preparing for this that this is going to be a boring kind of sermon. But it's something that needs to be heard, right? So that's why. And I think if I will do this like in any other Sunday, it might be a little awkward. But if I do it now because it's Martin Luther King Day tomorrow, then it makes it a little bit more appropriate. Okay. So let's pray.